Good evening. Welcome to the third annual Reimagining Faith and Public Life event at John Brown University. In the spirit of JBU's centennial festivities, tonight's theme is the future of faith and public life. We hope this evening proves to be a time of thoughtful reflection and expanded perspectives as we consider how to faithfully identify as citizens of two kingdoms in the midst of ongoing political and cultural challenges. We want to extend a special invitation, or a special welcome rather, to those joining us tonight as visitors to John Brown University. Thank you for your company this evening. My name is Daniel Bennett. I'm an associate professor of political science, and I also serve as the assistant director for the Center for Faith and Flourishing here at JBU. Before introducing our speakers, I'd like to take a moment to recognize several people who were instrumental in putting this event together this evening. Dr. Tricia Posey is a professor of history. She's a professor of history and the director of the university's Honor Scholars Program. We've worked together on reimagining faith and public life for 3 years now. While it is a lot of work to bring these events together, I've enjoyed collaborating with her and learning from her over these past few years. Rebecca Kelly and Bailey Coleman put in a lot of work behind the scenes preparing for this event. You should thank them afterwards. Thanks also to Frank Hubert for leading a group of faculty and staff through a book discussion group related to this event. And thanks to Jake Smith for once again for designing our promotional materials for the year. We're also thankful for several offices on campus that provided financially for this event. These include the Center for Faith and Flourishing, the Honor Scholars Program, the Division of Humanities and Social Sciences, the Office of Christian Formation, the Office of Academic Affairs, the Office for the Advancement of Teaching, Learning, and Scholarship, and the Office of the President. Thank you also to One for All at Middle Tennessee State University for their support toward tonight's conversation. Finally, we are grateful for a grant from the American Enterprise Institute's Values and Capitalism Project, which helped fund tonight's event and provided dozens of books for faculty, staff, and student reading groups over the past several weeks. And now on to the schedule for this evening. After I introduce our speakers, each of them will take a turn for some initial thoughts on tonight's theme. After these 3 sets of remarks, Dr. Posey and I will lead the speakers in a time of moderated conversation to be followed by a time of questions from the audience. But first, allow me to introduce tonight's speakers. David French, sitting to my closest, right on stage? There he is a senior writer for National Review and a senior fellow at the National Review Institute and a contributor to Time magazine. He's a graduate of Harvard Law School, past president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, and a former lecturer at Cornell Law School. He has served as senior counsel for the American Center for Law and Justice and Alliance Defending Freedom. He is also a former major in the United States Army Reserve and was awarded the Bronze Star. New York Times best-selling author, French's next book, The Great American Divorce: Why Our Country is Coming Apart and Why It Might Be for the Best, is scheduled to release late next year, Christmas Day 2020, according to Amazon.
No, before then.
Before then, hopefully, okay. But you can find it on Amazon already. You can do that. Let's hope so. And actually, just last week, David announced that he will soon, as in Monday, be joining The Dispatch. He'll be leaving National Review and helping to launch The Dispatch, so be on the lookout for that. Jemar Tisby, seated next, well, on the end, is president of The Witness, a Black Christian collective, where he writes about race, religion, and culture. He is also the co-host of Pass the Mic, a podcast that amplifies dynamic voices for a diverse church. His writing has been featured in The Atlantic, The Washington Post, CNN, Vox, and The New York Times. He has spoken nationwide at conferences on racial justice, U.S. history, and the church. He is the author of The Color of Compromise: The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, and is a PhD candidate in history at the University of Mississippi, studying race, religion, and social movements in the 20th century. And after this morning's fantastic chapel message, he can add JBU chapel speaker to his impressive resume. And it's good. And last, but certainly not least, is Jenny Yang. She's the Vice President of Advocacy and Policy at World Relief, where she provides oversight for all advocacy initiatives and policy positions at World Relief, representing the group's advocacy priorities to the U.S. government and mobilizing churches on advocacy campaigns. She has conducted research on refugee and asylum law in Madrid, Spain, through the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, and is on an active deployment roster for that important organization. She is also a former chair of the Refugee Council USA Africa Work Group, and she is the co-author of Welcoming the Stranger, Justice, Compassion, and Truth in the Immigration Debate, and a contributing author to Talking Taboo, American Women Get Frank About Faith and Global Diasporas and Mission. And now please join me in welcoming our three speakers, beginning with David French.
Thank you so much. It's a real privilege to be here. I've had just a tremendous time meeting students, and I've been in all 50 states, but I haven't been in every region of all 50 states. So this is my first pilgrimage to Northwest Arkansas, which is unfortunate. I should have done this before, because the first job I ever had in my life was selling guns at Walmart. And if that isn't the most hashtag America thing ever, but it's a real privilege to be here. So I'm going to talk to you about imagining Christian engagement in our political life now and in the future. And I think that this has to begin with a very simple prayer. And if it doesn't begin with this very simple prayer, we're going to get off track almost immediately. And here it is. Dear God, please save me from being a partisan. Save me from being a partisan. Now, why would we do that? Now, I did not say, save me from politics. I did not say that. I didn't say, save me from voting for a Democrat or a Republican. I didn't say that, because in most races, that's going to be, one of those two is going to be a logical choice. Not always. If somebody says it's always a binary choice. You know, I don't know about y'all, but in my ballot, there's more than two names, typically. So it's just not a binary choice. But it's not to save me from voting for Democrat or Republican. Sometimes that's going to be the correct choice. It is save me from being a partisan, and specifically save me from the maladies of the partisan mind. Okay, so here's what I mean when I say that. Right now in this country, we have two really big problems. Two, not just two, but let's isolate two, okay? One is a sort of a classic problem that we think of when we think of politics, and it's a problem of justice. What is the right outcome of policy? What is the right regulation or lack of regulation for guns? What is the right policy surrounding abortion? What is the right policy surrounding incarceration? These are the kinds of things that when we think of politics, we think of policy. And we have those problems, and we should engage on those problems. And we should work towards a just result as we humbly and faithfully seek the Lord to know and to learn and to inform ourselves on what is the just result. So this is politics as we traditionally envision it. It's about creating a policy outcome. But then there's another one. It's not just about justice. The other problem we have, and we have problems with lack of justice in this country, is enmity. It is hatred. And I would say this is becoming one of the dominant forces in American public life. So let's look at some statistics. Let's go pre-Trump, because I kind of don't like to, a lot of people sort of think we have three great eras in American history, or world history actually. We have BC, okay, before Christ. We have AD, after death, Anno Domini. I think that's what that means, but anyway, that's what I learned in like Sunday school. BC AD, you all know that. And then we have AE, after escalator, in June 2015 when Trump came down the escalator. It's like politics just started then. But let's go down to 2014. And what I'm going to tell you guys will alarm you about the level at which Americans hate each other. So in 2014, the Pew Research Center had been tracking something called negative polarization for a long time. And what is negative polarization? Negative polarization is the belief that I'm a Republican, or the desire to be a Republican, not because I love Republican ideas so much, but because I really don't like Democrats. Or it's the belief that I'm going to be a Democrat not because I really like Democrat ideas, but I really don't like Republicans. So in 2014, 82%, if you asked Republicans, what did they think of Democrats? 82% would say I either strongly or somewhat don't like Republicans. If you asked Republicans, 82% would say I either strongly or somewhat dislike a Democrat. All I know about them is they're a Democrat. And 82% of Republicans would either strongly or somewhat dislike that person. That's all you know. And the number of people who had a positive regard for Democrats was like 10 or 12%. I mean, that's all you would know. That's horrible. Fortunately, the Democrats, as befitting their reputation as the party of tolerance, were much better. Only 78% of them either strongly or somewhat disliked a Republican. We're in a position where and do you think it's gotten better since 2014? It's much worse. Earlier this year, a group called Hidden Tribes called Better for America has released a series of surveys and studies under a Hidden Tribes project. They call it Hidden Tribes to try to discern, like, what are the hidden forces that are impacting America? And they found that if you were a Republican or a Democrat, your negative view of the opposing side, of ascribing them negative traits like closed-minded or racist, was 85 to 84% were doing to ascribe those negative values to the other side. So bad that more people right now, according to some surveys, would rather a person marry a person of another religion than of another political party. So think about that. They would rather their kid risk hell than vote for Hillary, okay? I mean, this is how bad it's getting. I could do this all day. I mean, we have in some polls significant minorities of Americans, say 20% or so, which is only about 60 million people, believe and ascribe to their political opponents subhuman characteristics. A large percentage of people believe that the country would be better off if a large percentage of their fellow citizens just died. Just died. Now, I'm a little familiar with this phenomenon. I saw this emerging in the 1990s because I went to a small Christian college in Nashville, Tennessee, named Lipscomb University. Some of you have heard about it. The fellowship of small Christian colleges is tight. We know each other. Or maybe you don't. But anyway, it's a small Christian college called Lipscomb. And I grew up in a small town in Kentucky, went to a small Christian college. And by this miracle, which I think was, I think the technical name for it was the redneck diversity quota, I got into Harvard Law School. And I was, a lot of geographic diversity there. I was like the only Kentuckian, maybe a couple of us. And I felt like a fish out of water. But I went to law school, and I thought I was going to be engaging with the smartest people in America, future leaders of America, on the issues that mattered. And I couldn't wait. And so one of the first things I did is I formed a pro-life group called the Society for Law, Life, and Religion. Now, one thing I would tell you guys, if you're forming a student group, always think of the acronym. So for the next 25 years, that group was known on campus as SLUR. Not a great pro-life witness. But we had this policy at the law school where you paid a health services fee, and you would pay for elective abortions, but as part of the health services fee. But if you had a conscientious objection to it, you could write the health services agency, and they would refund a small part of that fee. They would refund the portion on average paid for elective abortions. It's very good of Harvard to have that policy. It's a good policy. So the first thing that we did as our young pro-life group of 3 people was we sent a letter to the entire student body, all 1,500 students. And I made a mistake. At the end of the letter, which I printed off, all 1,500 copies, this is pre-email, I put, if you want to take advantage of the refund, contact David French, and I gave my contact information. And I put in 1,500 pieces of paper into boxes, and then I go back to my dorm, and I begin my evening study routine. So this is bonus, y'all. I'm sure there's some pre-law students here. So this is how I studied at Harvard Law School. 7 p.m., watch Star Trek Next Generation. 8 p.m., watch basketball on ESPN. 11 p.m., watch SportsCenter. At midnight, panic because you haven't studied yet. Study until the 2:30 a.m. SportsCenter. Skip your first class. It's amazing. So anyway, so I did that, and I go after the school day, and I go to my box, and it's stuffed full of paper, just stuffed full of paper. And I think, this is before all the idealism and hope had been just ground out of my life. And I thought, I have just tapped into the latent pro-life movement at Harvard Law School. And I open the first sheet of paper and it says, "Why don't you go die, you bleeping fascist?" What? You should die. Now, I want to be very clear. I don't like to exaggerate. There will be people who have endured real death threats in life. These were death aspirations. It's not, I'm going to kill you. I just want something to do it. Someone, something. And these were the future leaders of America. I hate you this much. I hate you this much. And this has become the dominant tone of discourse in the United States of America. And here is what I would challenge you and challenge us. Right now, there is a very powerful move in this country to tell Christians, you have to choose a side and fight like hell for that side. And I use those words intentionally. You have to choose a side and you have to fight like hell for that side because everything depends on it. And what ends up happening, what do? We wrap our arms around sometimes vile people. We wrap our arms around people who say horrible things to their fellow man. In a time of negative polarization, in a time of enmity, when one of the crises in our lives, in our politics, in our country, is enmity. And how is that consistent with a Christian witness that is based around verses like this? Bless those who persecute you. Love your enemies. Who is the community in this country who is best equipped to deal with the challenge of enmity? I would say it's the community who says that I believe to the bottom of my heart I should bless those who persecute me. I should love my enemies. Instead, are we that? Are we? No, we're not. In fact, if you look at the white evangelical Protestant world, we are some of the most dedicated partisans in the entire United States of America. In the entire United States of America. That's who we are. That is what defines us. We are the most dedicated partisans. And as the most dedicated partisans, we become tribal and we act tribal. And so what I'm saying is what we have to do is rediscover love for even those who we would consider a political enemy. And that has to characterize who we are going forward. It doesn't right now, but it has to characterize who we are going forward. And I think one thing that is absolutely critical. How do we do this? How do we do this? I'm going to close with this. We have to extend ourselves. And here is the way I would say it. I believe in the legal, I'm a lawyer. I believe in the legal corollary, just to take an example, of the golden rule. Fight for the rights of others that you would like to exercise yourself. Fight for the rights of others you would like to exercise yourself. I'll give you an example. Trigger warning. Trigger warning for every conservative in this room, okay? This is about to not be a safe space. Okay. Conservatives are very used to arguing against woke, progressive, capitalist censorship, right? We hate it when big tech fires a Christian or fires a libertarian because those snowflake liberals can't handle being around dissenting speech. You know, that's sort of I just summarized 2,000 segments on Fox News. And so here's the trigger warning. That's the world I grew up in, right? And then like a couple of years ago, there's a guy played football, and he took a knee during the national anthem. And the president of the United States of America said, fire him. And conservative America, completely dedicated to civil liberties and hating snowflakery, said, no, don't fire. No, that's not what happened. We went, yeah, fire him. And, yeah, right. See? And that's what happens. Look at what's happening to the younger generation. Yeah. And here's what I'll just real quick. Wasn't that an opportunity to say no? Like, even if I disagree with his stand, I disagreed with parts of his stand. I disagreed with that particular action. But the idea that he should be fired for it was repugnant. And it was particularly repugnant because of the context, which was forced patriotism, which was, reminds us, and should remind us, because I know you're all constitutional law geeks in here, of the 1943 case, of course, say it with me, West Virginia v. Barnett, and in which in 1942, January 1942, the West Virginia Board of Education implemented a rule. Now, this is January 1942. It's a month or so. It's a month after Pearl Harbor. We are on the ropes as a country, on the ropes. And the West Virginia Board of Education says, you have to stand and pledge allegiance to the flag to start every school year. Now, if there's ever a time to require forced patriotism, it's when American forces are in full retreat across the entire Pacific at the hands of a Japanese army that at that moment seemed like it might menace the west coast of the United States. Shouldn't we all be together? And everyone said, yeah, let's all stand together, except for 2 young Jehovah's Witness girls. Now, I'll tell you this about the Jehovah's Witness. I am not a Jehovah's Witness. I haven't read a syllable of the Watchtower. But if you guys knew how many of our basic civil liberties you owe to Jehovah's Witnesses, you would be nice to them when they come to your door. So these 2 young Jehovah's Witnesses don't stand. And in the middle of the darkness of the Second World War, when the issue is in doubt, in 1943, the United States Supreme Court says these words: if there's any fixed star in our constitutional constellation, it is that no official, high or petty, may prescribe what is orthodox in law and politics and nationalism and culture. A ringing declaration of liberty that was centered around that. Do you know how many Christians have relied upon that to preserve their witness in hostile public spaces? Do you know how many times I relied upon that to try to preserve, as a lawyer, the witness of Christians in hostile public spaces? And then you have a guy doing the exact same thing that spawned one of the greatest cases in the history of American constitutional law. And because we have the partisan mind, we said, no, fire him. So we have 2 issues. We have an issue of justice. And I haven't talked about that. I'm sure some of my fellow panelists will. And I'm not saying for one second abandon your conviction about life, about liberty, about incarceration, about police violence, about taxation, about healthcare. Don't abandon that at all. Pursue it, because if you believe it's right and true and good, then it's right for you to pursue it. And let me say, I'm not a moral relativist. If you're informed and believe it's right and true and good, we'll pursue it. But at the same time, we, as the community of believers, are the ones who are most uniquely equipped to pursue justice with love. And we're the community that right now in the United States of America is by reputation, least likely to do that very thing. And that's the challenge. That's the challenge. Pursue justice without enmity, and not just without enmity, but with love. Thank you all.
Thank you for that language, David, of giving a trigger warning to conservative-leaning folks. I feel like my entire existence is a trigger warning to conservative-leaning folks, politically, I should say. I have some prepared remarks that I'll read in a moment, but let me preface it this way. It's with quite a bit of trepidation that I come up here and talk about faith in public life. And I think that very trepidation speaks to some of what David was talking about the level of polarization in not only our society, but specifically the church. I used to think that the most controversial topic I could talk about was race and racism among Christians. It turns out the most controversial topic I can talk about is politics. The blowback I've received when I commented on politics paled. It was eons beyond what I received simply for talking about race. But as I've studied, as I've learned, as I've lived, you can't separate politics and race. The two go together. Nor can you separate your Christian faith from politics. That is how we do life together in this republic. So, with that as a preface, let me enter in. Envisioning the future of faith and public life requires us not only to look ahead, but back and around us as well. To contemplate the future of faith and public life is to examine both the past and the present to determine what needs to be done in the coming days. So I'll structure my brief remarks around these three areas: the past, the present, and the future of faith in public life. Now, here's where it gets interesting. I want to talk about some of the boundaries of my discussion because I can't do everything. First, I'll be focusing on the United States, knowing full well that public life entails international dimensions as well, but I'm trying to stay in my lane here. Second, I'm going to talk a lot about white evangelicals. Not because they're more important than any other racial or political group, but because in our current public life, white evangelicals tend to attract the most media attention and occupy the center of many conversations about faith and public life. Right or wrong, that's what we're dealing with. I think the future has to change, but in the present, this is a reality we have to acknowledge. I also speak mainly as a historian, not as a political scientist or a theologian, although I'll draw in both politics and theology in my remarks. Additionally, I'll focus mainly on politics as an expression of public life, knowing full well that public life could include other things like the arts and education and finance. And finally, as has often been said, the personal is political. So I'll also be speaking from my own experience as a black Christian and a black man in the United States. So let's begin. Looking at the future of faith and public life requires examining the past. When I wrote my book, The Color of Compromise, The Truth About the American Church's Complicity in Racism, the reactions were interesting. So, in response to much of the history from the colonial era in the 1500s and 1600s on up through the Jim Crow era up to about the 1950s and the Brown v. Board decision, the responses were relatively muted. With the exception of the Civil War, which one could argue is still being fought on ideological grounds, not too many people had objections to that further back history. It was so distant and times are so different now that most people didn't raise many objections. The controversy begins when the history is more recent, particularly when we talk about the history of race, politics, and Christians. So, to put a finer point on it, the religious right. That was the part that evoked the most response. We're looking at the early 1970s, pretty much on up to the present day. When we think about the religious right, when we think about white evangelicals and politics, what's the number one political issue that comes to mind? Tends to be abortion, pro-life, anti-abortion. The pro-life or anti-abortion stance has become so much a part of the origin story of the religious right that it's almost taken for granted that this is the core of what united people on the religious right. that it was the catalyst that mobilized people politically. Now, obviously, there are a lot of things that bring people to the table politically. But if you're making a hierarchy of issues, this right to life is right at the top. So what I'm going to say to you is a bit of history. You can take it, you can leave it, you can argue with the historian who did the primary source research, and I'm just quoting. But I want to trouble the waters a little bit. If you think that the main moral issue that brought together the religious right, particularly in the early 1970s, was abortion, well, here's something to think about. Prior to the late 1970s, white evangelicals paid little attention to abortion, mainly because they thought of it as a Catholic issue. Sometimes they even favored abortion. For example, in 1971, the Southern Baptist Convention, the nation's largest Protestant denomination, passed a resolution on abortion that called upon Southern Baptists to, quote, to work for legislation that will allow the possibility of abortion under such conditions as rape, incest, clear evidence of severe fetal deformity, and carefully ascertained evidence of the likelihood of damage to the emotional, mental, and physical health of the mother. A poll in 1970 discovered that 70% of Southern Baptist pastors, quote, supported abortion to protect the mental and physical health of the mother. 64% supported abortion in cases of fetal deformity, and 71% in cases of rape. So, at the very least, we can say that consensus on abortion had not yet been realized yet among white evangelicals who leaned politically conservative. So if it wasn't primarily opposition to abortion that sort of called white evangelicals to mobilize politically, then what was it? Historian Randall Balmer argues that the true origins of the religious right were not in objections to abortions, but in objection to racial integration. Before you judge, listen. In 1971, the Supreme Court upheld the decision in Green v. Connolly that said that racially discriminatory private schools are not entitled to federal tax exemption provided for charitable educational institutions. In other words, they were looking at private schools, many of them Christian. You know that many of these private Christian academies started in the late 1960s and early 1970s. In response to further legislation designed to amplify the 1954 Brown v. Board decision about school integration. A lot of schools had not yet integrated. And then the court handed down an order that says you must integrate by this certain time period, and lo and behold, all of these private academies popped up. In the town where I live, on the other side of Arkansas, there is literally in operation today a segregation academy. Started in 1971, and it's an open secret. Everybody knows its true origin. You're not going to find it on the website, of course, but they know why it was started, and it remains to this day almost 100% white, while the public schools are almost 100% filled with black students. So this decision is handed down. This ruling threatened the financial solvency of any Christian school that could not demonstrate an integrated student body or show positive efforts to desegregate. And it only took one school, Bob Jones University, to bring the threat of government-enforced integration and loss of tax-exempt status to the attention of Christian conservatives and to politically mobilize them. So, founded in 1927 as a bastion of Christian fundamentalism by Bob Jones Sr., the university that bears his name had strict rules about behavior. They had rules for how students dressed, they forbid dancing, drinking, they regulated every part of students' lives, including who they were in relationship with. So for much of their history, they did not grant admission to black people at all. Then when they finally admitted black students in 1971, they wrote in the student handbook that black and white students could not date interracially. The Civil Rights Act and the IRS's newly adopted policies meant that Bob Jones University's stance on interracial dating, prohibiting it, placed it in violation of racial discrimination laws, so the IRS revoked the school's tax-exempt status in 1976. It was the IRS's actions around racial integration in Christian schools that sparked national outrage for a lot of Christians, a lot of white Christians, because they viewed their views on race and segregation and integration as strongly, deeply held religious beliefs. And they looked at this as government interference of their Christian beliefs. Now, you don't have to take my word for it. A Republican political operative who is one of the architects of what became the religious right and of many Republican strategies, his name was Paul Weyrich, explained, quote, "What galvanized the Christian community was not abortion, school prayer, or the Equal Rights Amendment. What changed their mind was Jimmy Carter's intervention against the Christian schools, trying to deny them tax-exempt status on the basis of so-called de facto segregation." Take that information, do what you will with it. But history is important as we think about the future of faith in public life. Let me also add in this quick caveat. My goal is not to make a Republican a Democrat or a Republican or an independent or a Green Party or whatever it might be. My hope is that we would be Christians in whatever party we are, which means every party has to be called to account from a scriptural standpoint. No party perfectly models biblical justice. That being said, let me focus on what I know, which is my experience as a Black Christian in a post-escalator world. These are the conversations I just couldn't miss the opportunity to tell you from the perspective of a Black Christian, certainly not speaking for all Black Christians, but some of these conversations that you may not hear, because we don't talk about it around white folk. Today, white evangelicals have become synonymous with the Republican Party. This continues to have extremely negative effects not only on our public life, but on the integrity of the gospel itself in the eyes of Christians and non-Christians alike. Why focus on the Republican Party right now? Not because there aren't plenty of huge issues with the Democratic Party, but because one party has set itself up as the big tent party of multiple religions and all kinds of diversity. The other party has set itself up as the one true Christian party. Without me even saying which is which, you can already label them. So for any party that embraces an image as God's own party, they have to come under scrutiny for that allegiance. So let's talk about the notorious 80%. The 4 in 5 white evangelicals who pulled the lever for Donald Trump. This number, for comparison's sake, is slightly higher than it was even for Mitt Romney and George Bush. White evangelicals, just to be honest, and especially from a Black person and a Black Christian's perspective, have lost whatever moral credibility they may have once had because they remain this president's most loyal supporters. Christians of other races and ethnicities look on with near disbelief as people who call on the name of Christ continue to support the eroding of our public life and public institutions through the brash actions of a man who has demonstrated he is thoroughly unfit for the presidency, especially and in particular for the ways he has addressed race. In the midst of this political chaos, many Black Christians like myself have reevaluated our relationship with white evangelicals. I encourage you to Google an article by New York Times journalist Campbell Robertson. It's called "A Quiet Exodus: Why Black Worshipers Are Leaving White Evangelical Churches." He interviewed Black Christians in white evangelical spaces after the election of Trump and found that many of us were leaving. Shaniqua Walker Barnes, a professor at the McAfee School of Theology, said, "We were willing to give up our preferred worship style for the chance to really try to live this vision of the beloved community with a diverse group of people." That didn't work. Michael Emerson, who co-authored the landmark book Divided by Faith, Evangelical Religion and the Problem of Race in America, in that same article, he said this: the election itself was the single most harmful event to the whole movement of reconciliation in at least the past 30 years. It's about to completely break apart. I'm telling you this as a black Christian who likely checks many of the same theological boxes that you do. I'm telling you this because if we put our beliefs on paper, you probably couldn't tell the difference between you and I on most issues. I'm telling you this because this partisanship is actually an obstacle to the spread of the gospel. It hinders the integrity of our witness, especially as you think about it along racial lines. Now, I have personal experience with this. The day after the 2016 election, I remember staying up late into the night, early into the next morning, and the results came in and Trump won, and I remember the shock and the disbelief. How could this happen? I recorded a podcast that very same day in which I stated that that particular Sunday, I did not feel safe worshiping in a predominantly white evangelical congregation. I don't mean I felt physically threatened. I felt spiritually and emotionally fragile to the point where I couldn't be in worship and really focus on worship when I knew there were people in my own congregation who, it wasn't just about voting for this man. It was about the fact that I and so many other people of color, immigrants, women, refugees, Muslim, virtually any marginalized group, had practically jumped up and down, waving our hands, there's danger here. And then to have 8 in 10 vote for him. It was a telling experience. What I learned after that podcast is how talking about politics is far more controversial than talking just about race. So what happened after that podcast, some self-styled Christian apologists got a hold of it. They made videos on YouTube critiquing it, really trolling it, trolled us on social media, sent letters to our churches about our political stances. It had such a sort of physiological impact on me that there was probably about 3 months after that podcast where when I would get on social media, which I took a break from, but whenever I got back on it, my eye would twitch because of all the stress, because I knew there would be yet another comment. They called you names like communist, Marxist, social justice warrior. I kind of like that term. I want a t-shirt with that one. Or the dreaded word, liberal. They even questioned my theological orthodoxy and my very profession of faith, as if I wasn't a Christian. You got to understand, this isn't just about one man or one election. It's about the value and importance of black Christians and Christians of color. That we could raise every warning flag and sort of just be run over politically. After all these years of talking about racial reconciliation, holding panels, having coffee, doing pulpit swaps, we thought that white evangelicals might take our views into consideration. But when it came down to voting, whatever their priorities or political calculus, white evangelicals supported a man and more broadly a party that has come to represent everything that makes us feel less safe as racial and ethnic minorities. We learned the hard way that for many evangelicals in a political sphere, they valued our presence, but not our perspective. So, what is the future of faith and public life? First, white evangelicals have to decouple themselves from the Republican Party. This decoupling begins with a strong and public repudiation of Donald Trump's racism and xenophobia. We have to remember that this is a man brought on charges for discriminating racially against people renting apartments in his buildings, that this is a man who put out a full-page ad in several newspapers calling for the return of the death penalty in light of the Central Park Five, now the exonerated Five, a position he has yet to repudiate. This is a man who began his presidential bid calling some Mexicans rapists, calling immigrants from certain countries S-hole countries. I hope you don't just think of that politically, but how it affects other image bearers and other people of faith. It continues with a deep examination of how policies promoted by parties, both parties, but in particular policies such as tax reductions only for the extremely wealthy, a punitive criminal justice system that disproportionately impacts the poor and people of color, a repealing of voting rights protections affects the most marginalized. Third, the future of faith in public life requires white evangelicals to diversify their media consumption. Earlier today, Jenny shared with us that the media is more influential in shaping opinions on immigration than anything that happens in the church. We can broaden that to many political issues. So I don't think I'm overstating it when I say Fox News is more effective at discipling white evangelicals as to their politics than what happens in the pulpit. The future of faith and public life in the United States must also include a reckoning with the racism many Christians have publicly displayed in the life of this nation. We cannot address public life in the future if we have not examined the public life of Christians in the past. And that past, when it comes to white Christians politically, is very ugly. It's a history of compromise and complicity with racism. Now, if you didn't hear the chapel sermon this morning, this isn't about guilting you. This is about godly grief. This is about an honest look at the past. I was in Phillips County last week, or the week before, when they finally, 100 years later, commemorated one of the worst racial massacres in the history of the nation, the Elaine Massacre. Over 200 black sharecroppers killed for the gruesome offense of organizing for fair prices on cotton they themselves picked. Even federal government and soldiers were involved in the killing. No one was accountable. It was black people who were on trial. I could talk to you more and more. I could talk to you about the Virginia Assembly, a group of white Anglican Christian men who passed a law saying baptism wouldn't alter the state of bondage or freedom for an enslaved African, Native American, or mixed person. I could talk about the Baptist, Methodist, and Presbyterian splits over the issue of slavery prior to the Civil War. I could talk about the defenses of racial segregation in the Jim Crow era. I could talk about the support of people and policies who perpetuate racial inequality in the present. There needs to be a racial reckoning regarding Christians in public life in the past. Christians need to divest themselves of support of symbols of the Confederacy. From monuments to flags, just in Arkansas, there was a proposal that didn't even make it out of committee to change the single white star above the word Arkansas in the state flag. It represents now on paper the Confederacy. The proposal was to change it to represent Native American populations who were here before any of us were. It didn't make it out of committee. We weren't even talking about changing the design of the flag. Your next door neighbor, Mississippi, is the only state in the Union that still has the Confederate flag in its canton. And all 49 states, in my opinion, are complicit. How can we let that be? I can go on and on. Finally, reckoning will mean, I'll say the future of faith in public life means that Christians can't be afraid to get political. And I agree with David. There's a difference between being political and partisan. So many Christians I hear say we don't need to get too political. I think that reflects a highly individualistic view of Christianity and evangelicalism and a fundamental misunderstanding of how injustice works. Again, in their book, Divided by Faith, Emerson and Smith talk about the white evangelical cultural toolkit. They talk about individualism, relationalism, and anti-structuralism. I won't get into the details here. You can support them by buying that book. But what it boils down to is that many white evangelicals do not see injustice as a policy issue, but mainly as an interpersonal issue. So especially on issues of racial injustice, they want to focus on personal relationships to the exclusion of changing racist policies. They think they can fundamentally change race relations and inequality in this country without fundamental changes in the laws and policies that govern our life together. It won't happen. But insofar as politics has everything to do with how we treat one another in a defined civic space, then we have no choice but to be political. We have to realize that saying you're not political is, in fact, taking a political stance. Withdrawal is not an option. Retreat is not a remedy. When it comes to the future and of faith and public life for Christians, perhaps the worst action is no action at all. Thank you.
So I am a relatively new mother, if I can say that. I have a 4-year-old son and a 1-year-old. And I feel like with every new child I have, I say that I'm a new mother because I relearn what it's like to have a crying child in the middle of the night and to comfort him and to feed him in the middle of the night. And the first year of my younger son's life, his name is Joel, and he is 15 months now. He did not sleep through the night until he was 9 months old, which meant that for 9 months of my life, every 4 or 5 hours, I was being woken up by my cute little baby. And I told myself the reason babies are so cute is because they're absolute torture for a young mom who's trying to comfort them and feed them and trying to get them to go back to sleep. And the thing that I got used to in taking care of my young son was just knowing his cues of when something was wrong with him, of understanding that when he cried a certain way, it was because he was hungry, or he cried another way when he didn't want to be left alone, and he cried another way when he didn't want his older brother to bother him all the time. And I got used to understanding what his cries were all about. And God gives children the ability to use our voice and to cry when there's something wrong with them and they need attention. And as adults, we have the same ability to cry. Oftentimes as adults, we won't cry if we're hungry, at least not for most of us. We won't necessarily cry if we're really tired, at least not for most of us. But for all of us, we have the ability to use our voice to speak up when something is wrong, to identify when we do not feel comfortable with something that is broken around us. And as children, we use our voices to speak up when we need something as little children. And as adults, God gives us the same ability to use our voice and to speak up, to identify not something when something is wrong necessarily with ourselves, but when we identify brokenness within our society. I grew up in Center City, Philadelphia for many years, and my family eventually moved out to the northwest suburbs of Philadelphia, where I was really just raised as a Philadelphia girl. And I remember the church that I grew up in. It was a small Korean Presbyterian church where there was around 30 of us when I was really young, and then it grew into a church of about 3,000 to 4,000 members in the outskirts of Philly. And it's a huge mega church filled with Korean Americans that attend that church. And I remember growing up as a good Presbyterian girl, I learned about the 4 spiritual laws. I took missions trips to Mexico with my community, and I did all of these things that made me understand that the gospel was really about my individual salvation, my ticket to heaven. And I knew that if I knew and followed Jesus Christ, that was my way to get into heaven. And growing up in that kind of context and in that kind of community, that is central to my faith, and that is the foundation of my faith. But that is not all to my faith. And in fact, I remember when I was writing the book, Welcoming the Stranger, I was spending this time over Christmas break at my parents' home, and my mom said, "You're really struggling writing this book. I think you need a lot of prayer." So she took me to this Korean church that I grew up in, and my youth pastor was there, and he started praying for me. And he said, "I am so glad you're writing this book, because there are a lot of undocumented kids in the youth group that you grew up in. And I said, there's undocumented Korean kids? Koreans break the law? That was like unheard of to me. How is that possible? I never knew that Koreans could break the law. And Pastor Danny Kwan would say, no, there's a handful of Korean undocumented kids in our youth group. And I'm so glad you're writing this book about immigration, because I don't think people understand their story. I don't think people understand how the issue of immigration is impacting all immigrant communities, not just the Latino population. And he said, these undocumented kids have completely transformed how we do missions at my church, because these undocumented kids cannot leave the United States of America, which means that the missions trips that I went on to Mexico, these kids cannot go on, because if they leave the country, they will not be able to come back into the United States. So for years, they've lived only knowing this country, but being afraid to not leave this country as well. And so my youth pastor told me about now, instead of going to Mexico and ministering to the Mexican kids and partnering with a Mexican church, that their missions trips now constitute going into inner city Philadelphia and partnering with the Black church in Philly and learning about the injustices that the Philadelphia community faces. The entire issue of immigration has become a spiritual and a personal issue to this church, the church that I grew up in, and it became a personal issue for me as I started thinking about the issue of immigration. I studied abroad in my junior year in Spain, and I remember when I was riding the subway, there was a group of young Spanish teenagers that came on, and I identified a young African woman with her child sitting on the subway. And the first thing that these young Spaniards did when they came on is they pulled out spray cans and they started graffitiing all over the walls of the subway, "Get out of my country, Black people," in Spanish. And I was horrified that this happened, and as soon as I was going to say something to them, they left off the train. And I went over to this young woman and I said in my Spanish, "Are you okay?" And she didn't want to talk to me. You could tell that she didn't want to be bothered. And what bothered me about the incident was not so much that there was a blatant instance of racism that I witnessed right in front of me, but what really bothered me was that no one spoke up and said anything to these group of Spaniards to tell them what they were doing was wrong. And in fact, I was the only person on the entire train that actually went up to this woman to ask whether or not she was okay. And in that moment, I realized that for this woman to feel a sense of justice, to feel a sense of community, that she was probably a migrant who had come from Africa. She obviously felt vulnerable in that situation, and protection and assistance for her would not just be about legal protections that the state could offer her, but she also needed to feel a sense of community in the Spanish community of Spaniards that were actually actively welcoming her to tell her that she was okay there. And in that moment, I started to ask myself, what does the gospel have to say to this woman? What does the good news of Jesus Christ have to say in these moments of injustice that we encounter oftentimes as a people of color on a day-to-day basis? Does the gospel speak at all to the fact that we encounter such instances of racism? Does the gospel speak at all to the struggles that a lot of immigrant communities have to navigate a bicultural community? What does the gospel say about these issues? Growing up in a Presbyterian church, I knew my Bible inside and out. But it wasn't until I started grappling with the social challenges of the world today that I realized that the gospel of Jesus Christ has so much to say about the social condition that we're in. In fact, what you see throughout Scripture is that justice reflects the heart of God, and he exhibits it in the very actions he took throughout the Old Testament. For example, in Psalm 146, it says, "The Lord watches over the alien and sustains the fatherless and the widow." It says in Zechariah 7:10, it says, "Do not oppress the widow or the orphan, the alien or the poor." And it says in Malachi 3:5 that I will be quick to testify against those who defraud laborers of their wages, who oppress the widows and the fatherless, and deprive aliens of justice. What you see through these verses alone is that a God of justice is a God who acts upon the justice, that he is a God who watches over, who does not oppress, who testifies against. And if these are characteristics and actions of God, then are we ourselves carrying out those actions in the way that we live our life to pursue justice in the world around us? Are we testifying against? Are we not oppressing? Are we watching over? Are we providing care and concern with the very people that God calls the most vulnerable in the Scriptures? In fact, you see this idea of the pursuit of justice, not just in the character of God, but in Jesus' life and his time here on earth. In fact, it says that the first readings that Jesus had in the temple was from Luke 4:18, where he read from the scroll of Isaiah, in which he said that the Spirit of the Lord is on me, because he has anointed me to proclaim the good news to the poor. He has sent me to proclaim freedom for the prisoners and recovery of sight for the blind. In a community today where people question whether or not social justice is a part of the gospel, when I read these verses, I say, well, how is the pursuit of justice not an essential part of the good news of Jesus Christ? When Jesus himself is saying that he is proclaiming good news to the poor, when he is proclaiming freedom to the prisoners, when he's recovering the sight of the blind, these are physical manifestation to an individual salvation. The good news of Jesus Christ calls us not just to an individual relationship with him, but to a community of suffering and of brokenness in which the good news is tangible actions of justice to those in these broken situations. The gospel and the good news of Jesus Christ is not just good news for ourselves, but it is good news for the entire watching world that is wondering what Christianity is all about. In fact, many people look at the things that are happening around them, and many of those outside of the church are wondering whether or not God actually exists because of the suffering that they see in the world. The way that we are living out our faith in the public square will demonstrate to a person who has never heard of Jesus before what the values and the teachings of Jesus are in the public square. These are individuals that may never set foot inside of the church building, but they will learn about who Jesus is through what we say in the public square. The full expression of our faith requires that we engage in public conversations that shape people's understanding about what the kingdom of heaven is all about. In fact, what we know about Jesus himself is that he left all of his power and privilege to commune with those of us who are broken and sinful. And if that is what Jesus has done for us, then we as a church have a responsibility to leave our privilege behind and to be in community with those who are broken and suffering around us as well. Many of us were outraged when we found out that there was a policy by the White House, and when they felt like a deterrent strategy for the many millions or the thousands of individuals that were crossing our border was to take children away from their families. The idea that the separation of families is either a deterrent or that it is something that is valid in any sense of the word because individuals are supposedly breaking the rule of law should make us angry as a people of God. We know that the family institution is the building block upon which God ordains all of society. And it doesn't matter if you're an undocumented, if you're an asylum seeker, if you're a person of another color of skin, the family unit is what we should be fighting for tooth and nail. Several years ago, when this policy was being implemented, we saw the pictures at the border of little children being separated from their families. I, of course, thought about my little kids, and I thought to myself, if I knew nothing but poverty and persecution and violence, and I had to make the difficult choice of leaving everything behind to find safety for my kids, I would be appalled and be praying to God that God would deliver me from this situation. And if I entered into a community and the government separated me from my children, I would be absolutely devastated. And I would ask God, where is the church? You know, for many of us, we saw those policy issues and we gave the authority to the government to say, well, this is an issue that doesn't impact me, that I shouldn't speak out. But many churches actually spoke out. They mobilized, they enacted, and they spoke out against these edicts and these decisions by the White House. And a few weeks later, the president signed an executive order saying that he would end family separation. This idea of mobilizing our voices to speak up for the most vulnerable, of using our influence to influence the policies and the decisions of the most powerful are critical when we talk about impacting those who are suffering around us. You know, oftentimes we think about being stewards of the resources and the gifts that God has given us, but God also calls us to be stewards of our influence, to be stewards of the voice that God has given us to speak up for the most vulnerable around us. And when we do so, I believe we have an opportunity to fill in the vacuums, to reflect our values in the public square when a broken and hurting world is wondering whether or not the Jesus that we follow actually exists. You know, there is a difference between being partisan and being political. And I believe we are called to be political, but not necessarily called to be partisan. Being partisan means that we are wedded ourselves to a specific political party, believing that they have all the answers to society's problems. But being political means that we are engaging in the way that our society is ordered in the polis and actually using our voices and our experiences and our story to influence how our elected officials order the society around us. I believe if we are prophetically political, that we can lead to changing systems and structures that will lead to the flourishing of all. But if we become overtly partisan, that we will become tools of an empire to perpetuate injustice. I believe we are called to be political, but we are not necessarily called to be partisan. Conversations around race, conversations around immigration, conversations around gun violence, and around climate change are very difficult conversations to have. But because a lot of these conversations are happening on our social media feeds and not in the local church or not even in forums like this, it has led to a crisis of discipleship in which our response to these tough social issues is more informed by what media pundits are saying than what the Bible is teaching us through the reading of Scripture. This crisis of discipleship is leading to a crisis of identity in our public witness, because at a time when we should have a consistent pro-life biblical witness in which we're speaking the values of Jesus in this public square, we have become broken and erratic and become inconsistent in how we are representing Christ to a watching world. I fear that national security and comfort have become the new prosperity gospel in America today. That instead of seeking wealth and resources, that we have elevated the rule of law above love for our neighbor. And in fact, we have used religiosity to deter ourselves from being in very relationships with the people whom God called blessed in the Beatitudes. I believe, as followers of Jesus, that we cannot truly love our neighbors without addressing the structures and the systems in which our neighbors live. And I believe, as followers of Jesus, that we are called to address the spiritual condition of our neighbors, but also the physical and social conditions that our neighbors live in every day. When you look at the history of the laws in our country, when we elevate the rule of law, we are basically saying that the law is more important and it cannot be changed or is moral at all times. But in the history of the laws of the United States, we have had laws. Their Constitution actually has said that Native Americans were savages, that they were not deemed worthy enough to be a part of the Republic. We had laws in the book that said African Americans were 3/5 of a human being. There was a time in our period when we incarcerated U.S. citizens of Japanese ancestry because we thought that they were a threat to our democracy. There are times in our public life when our laws were completely unjust. And if our sinfulness, the human condition, perpetuated such unjust laws in the past, we have to ask the question if our own human condition has not changed. What are the ways in which our own sinfulness is perpetuating unjust laws and systems today? We have to look around us and especially pay attention to communities of color that are oftentimes experiencing the brokenness in our own lives. You know, when my two sons get sick, or one of my sons gets sick, I pay attention to that son. And my older son, if my younger son is sick, my older son may feel like I'm ignoring him because I'm spending time with my sicker son. But that goes to the public life as well, which is when there's a part of our body that he's saying that they are hurting. It is our responsibility as a church to listen to the pain that people of color are experiencing in this country, and to make their pain our pain as well. In 1 Corinthians 13, it says that when one part of the body suffers, that all of us suffer together. It is our responsibility to run this race of faith together, where the stories of suffering and of injustice that many black and brown people in this country have faced become our own struggles for justice in this community. Martin Luther King Jr. once said that on the one hand, we're called to play the Good Samaritan on life's roadside, but that should only be an initial act. One day we must come to see that the whole Jericho Road needs transformation, so that men and women will not be constantly beaten and robbed as they make their journey on life's highway. True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar. It comes to see that an edifice which produces beggars needs restructuring. What that means is many of us are familiar with the story of the Good Samaritan, and many of us are used to the ideas of showing compassion to individuals. And for us to feed the hungry and to clothe the sick are core parts of us demonstrating the good news of Jesus to the poor and the broken. But if we keep feeding the hungry and if we keep feeding the poor, but not looking at the root causes of what produced that poverty in the first place, we're basically perpetuating these systems which are not addressing the structural issues that will lift these people out of poverty in the first place. We need to love our neighbors individually, but we also need to look at the systems and structures that will allow our most vulnerable neighbors to flourish in the first place. So there are 3 encouragements that I want to leave with you as we think about what does the future of faith and public life look like. The first is that I believe one of the greatest challenges in the church today is the inconsistent application of the whole biblical truth in every area of our lives. And I want to say that again. I believe one of the greatest challenges today is the inconsistent application of the whole biblical truth in every area of our lives. I believe we as a church need to have a consistent, all-of-life, pro-life ethic from womb to tomb. That means that we care about the unborn in the womb, but we also care about them after they're born. We care about their physical and mental situation, and that we care about them until the day that they die. But I also believe we as a church have to recover spiritual disciplines as we pursue justice in the world. In stories of Esther and Nehemiah and Moses, we see that these individuals were not just leaders themselves, but they practiced the spiritual disciplines of lament and of fasting and of prayer as a way to ground the work that they were doing for the Lord. For us as a church, it's easy when we hear about a challenge that we face or when we hear about an injustice to just immediately post about it on social media. But I believe God wants us to go to him first in prayer, that he wants us to go to him first in lament. He wants us to fast because we know that many of the injustices we encounter are not just physical conditions, but there are spiritual strongholds that we encounter as a society as well. We need to fast and to lament and to pray. But lastly, I believe that we are called to share the good news of the gospel in community and not just by ourselves. You see in the story of Esther and Nehemiah and Moses that they were never called to pursue justice alone, that they always had a community of brothers and of sisters with resources and different skills in which they together pursued justice and they together pursued the will of God in their lives together. The work of justice is hard, and the work of reconciliation is hard. The work of sharing the good news of Jesus is hard. But when we do it as a community together, I believe we will experience more of God's profound faithfulness in our lives as we experience the whole gospel together. The Reconciling All Things is a book in which I'm going to read a quote from them, and they said that the justice of the Lord's table is not simply a punitive justice, but a far more radical form pursued within the vision of costly communion to bring together what has been torn apart. There is going to be a cost in our resources and our time to pursue this idea of a godly kingdom. But I believe if we fast and we pray and lament and we do it in community together, that we will have a consistent pro-life ethic that changes the world in how they view and understand the teachings of Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you 3 very much. In a bit, we're going to have a time of questions from the audience. There are pieces of paper on the aisle, the interior of the aisle here. If you have a question that you'd like to ask, we would ask you to write it down on the piece of paper. And when you have the question written, please just kind of hold it up, I suppose, and one of our helpers, Bailey, will run around and collect these questions from you. So be thinking about those.
Sure. Our first question for the 3 of you has to do with the church and its public witness today. And each of you touched on this in some way, I think, and I appreciate the fact that each of you talked about the important role that political engagement plays in the public witness of the church. So where are we at today with that? And how can we improve in the years ahead?
Can I start real fast? Okay, step one, stop being hypocrites. Okay? So I'll give you a great example. And this is a person that has done really wonderful, wonderful, wonderful things in the world. And I'm not passing judgment on his entire life's work. He's done more than I'll ever do for the least of these. So let me begin with that caveat. But when you have a structure where you say in 1998 that if a president will lie to his wife and his daughter, he will lie to America, which is right. I mean, let's just be honest here. That was very right. And that's a reason, especially when the lies are under oath, to impeach and remove somebody, which is a position I happen to agree with. And then in 2018, you say, well, that business between the porn star and the president was just his business. That's between him and his wife. And then you turn around in 2019 and say Pete Buttigieg shouldn't be married to a guy. What do you think the message that's being sent is? It's Democrats got to uphold the Bible, and Republicans, well, we kind of understand, Come here, big guy, you're going on religious liberty. Outside of the community of Christians, where we can twist ourselves into pretzel knots to say why that this is okay, outside of the Christian community, how does that look? And when we, and I talk to a lot of Christians and they get very aggrieved, and here's one of the reasons why they're aggrieved. They say, look, in all my life, I try my hardest to uphold the gospel. I love my wife. I love my kids. I'm honest in my business. I'm serving in the soup kitchen. I'm sleeping in the homeless shelter. I'm doing all of these great things. How dare you judge me on politics? How dare you judge me on my political actions? Well, there's a lot of people in the world, that's the only interaction they have with you. That's the only prism through which they see you. They don't sit next to you in the homeless shelter. They're not right next to you when you're navigating with your kids through difficult challenges in life. They see you in this one area, and they see massive hypocrisy, massive changes in the way that we approach the public square about things like character, the importance of character. And they go, what? Why? And then we say, well, it's politics. There's a crisis. There's an emergency. We have to. And you're like, wait, well, hold on. Is that an attitude of hope and faith? Or is that an attitude of panic and fear? Is that a witness? And yet we've walled all this off, y'all. Like, there is not a single person in this room that would say, who's a Christian person who would say, okay, if your business is failing, you may not be able to make the mortgage. Your kids are going to have to be pulled out of their school. You're going to have to move. You're downsize your house. You're going to go through a massive crisis. You might face bankruptcy. So therefore, it's okay to engage in consumer fraud. Everyone would say, no, trust Jesus. Trust Jesus. Instead, we go, the court might go 5-4. That's too much for Jesus. And that's not the attitude of hope and faith. That's not approaching the world with confidence. Now, I'm not saying don't fight over the court. Gosh, I've fought over the court my whole life. It's not, but what it is to say is not at all costs. Not at all costs. And I just don't think Christians who live in the Christian bubble understand what we've done to ourselves. I just don't think we have. I think we're in denial about it. We don't understand it and what we've done, and to who you've gotten in bed with. During the campaign in 2015, I came out opposed to Donald Trump, very vocally. And I called out Donald Trump for being allied with the alt-right. Do y'all know what the alt-right is? Within minutes, I received images of my 7-year-old daughter in a gas chamber, photoshopped into a gas chamber, with Donald Trump in an SS uniform to push the button to kill her. Now, why would you put my 7-year-old daughter in a gas chamber? Because she happens to be African American. She's adopted, which the alt-right calls race cucking your family and raising the enemy. And for the next several months, we faced a parade of, I talked about death aspirations in my talk, of real threats. People would send my wife images of murdered and dying African Americans. Horrible, grisly images that if I had not been to war and seen things like that in real life, that would have scarred me forever. People hacked into our phones, threatened us, and it's continued. And it was the alt-right, some of the most loyal fans of Donald Trump. And people would say to me, David, it's just fringe. They're just wackos. You can't judge. But there was a guy who said, my goal is to make Breitbart.com the platform for the alt-right in America. And that guy was named Steve Bannon. And he was the chief strategist of the President of the United States of America. You gotta know who you're getting in bed with. And I tell you this, as a person who's not retreated 1 inch from my pro-life stance, you think you're pro-Second Amendment? Come look at my arsenal, okay? Just come look at it. I mean, I'm a lifelong conservative. And now I find that because I say no to lies, no to being in bed with these vile racists, that I'm confronted at Christian gatherings furious. And so that's why I say right from the get-go. And look, guys, we're just keeping it real here. We're amongst friends. This is just real talk. This is why I say from step one, just step one for us, let's stop being hypocrites.
I think for a lot of churches that we've worked with as World Belief, I think it's a challenge because political engagement, because for a lot of the white evangelical church, I would say in the 70s and 80s, it was so overtly partisan, so overtly political. A lot of churches have swung the other way and say, we do not want to touch politics at all because we don't want to be like, the religious right from the 70s and 80s. And so we have this swing in the other direction of a lot of churches not wanting to touch politics with a 10-foot pole. And so when I at least talking about political engagement and the need to be political, I think pastors have a role in taking these really tough political topics to teach about it from a biblical worldview, either from their pulpit or within the church. I think developing that theology and biblical worldview is critically important. But I also challenge us as individuals as well when I say as a church to be political, in that there's a responsibility for us to be aware of the injustices that are faced in our community every single day and to use our voice to speak up. Because when we do not speak up, there are people who fill in the vacuum who do not represent our values that are shifting the politics of our country. Oftentimes, it's been said that politicians are the ones with their fingers in the air trying to figure out how the political winds are shifting, and they'll just move in whatever direction the wind is blowing in. Well, it is our job to shift those political winds, to make sure that our elected officials are reflecting our values in the way that they're crafting our laws and policies. And when we stay silent, we're basically accepting the status quo. And so for us to speak up and to be political, it's actually saying that things as they are right now are not okay, and that we need to use our voice to speak up whenever we can.
Anything to add, Jemar? We're going to be looking through the questions that you all submitted. Bailey, there's one more right here. 2 more. Okay. And as we're looking through these questions, we have another question for you three. Looking ahead to the 2020 election, what are some qualities in a presidential nominee you would encourage Christians to consider as they wrestle with how to vote?
All right. So I have a general test that I apply for every candidate of any level. So it's a 2-part test. It is not negotiable. Both parts are neither negotiable. If you fail one, you're out. Number one is you have to have character commensurate with the office. So the highest office in the United States is President of the United States. I have the highest expectations of character from President of the United States. If somebody's a dog catcher, they can be shacking up as long as they're catching dogs. I have, because they don't have a cultural power that, say, the President of the United States does. So, number one, you have to have character commensurate with the office. Number two, you have to share my political values within a margin of error. Nobody shares each other's political values perfectly. If you don't pass either one, you don't get my vote. I have this really simple philosophy that says that one of the best ways to continue to get distasteful candidates into office is by voting for them. And so I think it's completely acceptable to sit out a race. I do. I think when there was about 200, when Roy Moore lost in Alabama in 2017, two things happened. If you looked at the metrics, number one is African American voters turned out at near general election numbers, especially black women. Huge turnout. And number two, about 250,000 white evangelicals stayed home. They just went on strike. And Roy Moore lost. And, you know, the funny thing is, contrary to all the partisans who were telling me the opposite, the Republic did not collapse without Roy Moore in the Senate. In fact, I kind of think it was addition by subtraction. And so that's how I approach it. And so if I have to leave a ballot blank on a particular race, even if it is President of the United States, I'm going to do it. Can I be a super nerd real fast? There's this incredible science fiction novel called Dune. Okay, yeah, now we're talking. Okay. And there's this phrase that Paul Muad'Dib Atreides says. All right, I'm already losing you. We're awesome. He says, the power to destroy a thing is the power to control a thing. Evangelicals act like they're the most persecuted minority in the United States, and yet we're the most powerful Christian community in the whole world. Who's more powerful? What Christian community is more powerful than the evangelical community in the United States of America? Wealth, political power? Evangelicals have an absolute veto power over the fortunes of the Republican Party. An absolute veto power. If evangelicals don't turn out for the GOP loses, period. The power to destroy a thing is the power to control a thing. And yet we live as if we're so weak and timid that we have to accept whatever. And that's just not the way it is. So live with faith and live with hope and live with confidence. Don't live with fear and with trembling and with panic, because that leads to compromise.
Anything either of you would add?
I'm not expecting any candidate to be perfect morally, nor to fully align with my beliefs as a Christian. I am looking for integrity so that when they make mistakes, confess, admit, change, kind of what we would expect of ourselves, our church communities, our children, that kind of a thing. What I'm focused on at this point, looking to 2020, is informing myself on policy. To be honest, 2016 was a catalyst for many people to finally really get politically engaged. And so some of us are playing catch up. If you are in an undergrad, if you're a college undergrad, you know, I remember when I was 18 to 22 and I was not that politically focused. I think there is a responsibility, whatever stage of life you are, if you're of voting age, to sort of inform yourself of these things and then choose wisely. You know, it's a matter of conscience. I would never sit up here and say, you know, this is the Christian candidate that you must vote for. But I do think it is incumbent upon us to be responsible, conscientious citizens, and in particular, looking at the way policies are affecting those with the least money, the least political mobilizing power, those kinds of things.
So this is one of the questions from the audience. I really like this question. When was the last time you changed your mind politically? And what did that look like?
I don't want to go first every time, so.
I'm thinking.
There's a technique in depositions. When you have a hostile witness, people hate silence, as I'm demonstrating right now. And you can actually just wait, future lawyers. Ask a question, and if they don't give the answer you want, just stop. And it's unbearable. and and they won't fess up, but they'll start talking. So anyway, now I'm going to be quiet. I can't take it. I can't take it. Well, it's an easy answer for me because I write about this stuff all the time. And one of the things I have endeavored to do as a writer is to work in public through, because I just don't think we have, I try to apply Micah 6:8 very imperfectly. Seek justice, love mercy, and walk humbly. And one aspect of walking humbly is to acknowledge when you were wrong. Okay. So I wrote a big piece a couple of years ago about why I changed the way I write about police violence. And that was an issue that was so I grew up law and order, Reagan, Republican. I remember watching Dirty Harry and going around in my, elementary school, go ahead, punk, make my day. You just have this in parts of America, you just have this very reflexively you're talking about rule of law, pro-authority, somebody's put on a uniform, you're very supportive of people in uniform, very appreciative of the police. And so you just have a default position that is like, and then when a lot of the stories initially out of Ferguson and the Michael Brown shooting turned out to be false, that just reinforced my view that a lot of what was happening in the world, the accusations about police violence were exaggerated. And then came case. There's one case. African-American, 50 years old, running away from a police officer who is trying to arrest, failure to pay child support? Running away from the officer, shot 4 or 5 times in the back, killed, and you watch on tape as the police officer moves his taser and puts it by the body. And you say, well, that's one case. That's awful. I'm fully with you. That's terrible. Then you watch what happened with Philando Castile, and you talked about this. I dissected the heck out of that case. And Philando Castile died trying to obey the officer's commands. Think about that. He said, give me your license and registration. Don't reach for your gun. And Philando Castile, very calm voice, you can hear it. I'm not reaching for it. I'm not reaching for it. The officer panics, shoots him dead right in front, and then tries to justify it later by saying he smelled marijuana smoke, and anyone who would have such disregard for the health of the child in the back seat was a threat to his life. So he fired multiple rounds of ammunition into a car with a child in the back seat. That makes no sense. Philando Castile. I would urge you, if you have doubts about how bad things can get, to watch, just Google the name Daniel Shaver. A man crawling on his hands and knees, begging for his life, shot dead. And then I began to realize something is happening here. And I served in Iraq, and I was a JAG officer, and so I did a lot of training and use of force. And I would go out on patrol. My commander had this view that was, I'm not going to have my JAG officer sitting behind the wire telling my soldiers how to use force when he doesn't know what it's like. So I'm like, yes, sir. And so I'm not saying I was out there all the time like Cav Scouts and armor officers. I served them, but I served with them enough to understand what it was like to be in some of those dangerous streets in the world. And I saw less restraint in the use of force in places like Sacramento than I saw in places like Balad Ruz, Iraq. And I said, whoa, that changed my paradigm. And so as I began to write more about these cases, I said, well, I owe people an explanation. Because in 2014, I'm writing things going after the excesses of Black Lives Matter. If you read me in 2014 and 2015, you would think, well, this guy's really focused on the excesses, the things I still disagree with about Black Lives Matter, but that's what I focused and drilled down on. And then something changed, and what changed is I got more evidence. And the last thing, and I'll stop, it wasn't just anecdotes, because people will come to me and they'll say, well, this is just anecdotes. Like, these are 5 names you mentioned in a nation of 320 million people. But in 2014, 2015, we thought the number of people killed by police was around 300, 320 a year based on highly flawed reporting. It turns out it's about 1,000 people a year. That's based on better reporting. So that's not, the plural of anecdote isn't data, but that's data. And so I just felt like I owed it to my readers to say, Man, hey guys, y'all need to join me in rethinking that. So that's one issue.
I think all of us need to be very aware of who our local prosecutor is, usually at a county level or a metro level. And these are elected officials. They exercise extreme amounts of power in the judicial system, determining, how to present cases, often running on their records as, their conviction rate, 90%, 95%, to show that they're tough on law, that they get convictions, et cetera, et cetera. I finally became aware of the sort of power that local prosecutors wield in the issue of incarceration, and so there happened to be a race, an election for the local prosecutor a couple years ago in my county, in my district. And so I called up both candidates. One was black, one was white, fully expecting that the black candidate would sort of have progressive views on incarceration, want to reform some things, want to reduce the disparities in sentencing, fully expecting that the white person, this was a nonpartisan race, but politically I knew each of them. The black person was a Democrat, the white person was Republican. And so fully expecting this white Southern Republican man to really be the law and order, tough on crime type of thing. And I won't say it was the opposite, because it wasn't as if the white candidate was super progressive. But the black candidate was the one who said, we need to have tougher sentences. We need to really crack down on people who are breaking the law with, namely, longer sentences, which have been shown not to be all that effective in reducing crime and disproportionately affect poor people and people of color. So that was an issue, not necessarily where I changed my mind, but where something unexpected happened, and I ended up voting for the white Republican candidate because his views on law enforcement were much better, I thought, in this case. So that's one instance where it really helped. Prior to speaking to each of them personally, I wouldn't have known that. And so just one thing to encourage you, even if it's just that one area of local prosecutors, to get involved.
Jenny, did you think of an example?
Yeah, it's funny because I remember I was in a forum with a Republican senator, and I actually asked him the same exact thing. I asked him, was there ever a time when you felt like your faith conflicted with your allegiance to the Republican Party? He said no, and he couldn't think of an issue or a time, and I was flabbergasted. And I won't mention who he was, but I know, I'm sorry. And I actually wish it was recorded because I looked around the room and everyone was like, oh, that's highly unusual. But I would say that I think for me personally, I've been working on the issue of immigration for many, many years. And I never wanted to talk about immigration. In fact, I shared this earlier, but I felt like my being the daughter of immigrants and being a young Asian American woman would discount my voice in this conversation, because instead of talking about the policies and the economics and the politics of immigration, that people would automatically say, well, you're only talking about this because you're an Asian American woman. They weren't taking my views seriously. And so when I started thinking and talking about immigration, I didn't want to talk about this because I always wanted to focus on refugees overseas and their plight and their persecution. And the more I found out about how broken our immigration laws are, how so many people wait in line for many, many years and can't even get through the legal way, how for most of white American ancestors that there was no illegal way for your ancestors to come. And so this line that my ancestors came the legal way, so why can't you, doesn't really work when there was no legal way to come through Ellis Island, when over 90% of the people were processed and could come through legally. And these were all things that I wasn't aware of. And so, I had the same conception, which is if you break the law, you're breaking the law. You need to get to the back of the line. I didn't feel like, oh, my family came legally and it gave me this superiority, but I just didn't understand the struggles of a lot of Latino immigrants, for example, and just how broken the immigration system was. And it wasn't until I started really understanding how the system was working, how our laws have been changed in a long time, that it wasn't just like a rule of law issue for me, that it became a lot more nuanced. And so I think politically, it made me understand and just get beyond the sound bites to really dig deeper into some of the issues as well.
That's great. And it seems to me that a couple of themes in each of your responses was doing your research and asking good questions. That's really important. There were so many really good questions from the audience, and we have time just for one more, so I'm really sorry. But I really like this question because it gets down to the practical. Each of you talked about justice in your comments. And so a couple of our questions asked, practically speaking, how do we pursue justice as Christians?
I will give you my quick and dirty framework. It's in the book, The Color of Compromise. I call it the Arc of Racial Justice. And it's an acronym that stands for Awareness, Relationships, Commitment. I believe all three of these must be part of our pursuit of racial justice. It's not a linear thing. You check off awareness, you check off relationships, and you check. It's constantly happening. We're constantly building onto these things. So one area of growth is awareness, like we were just talking about. When we learn more about these issues, when we're asking the right questions, when we inform ourselves, that can happen a lot of different ways, through watching documentaries, through going on pilgrimages to historical sites, through listening to folks like Jenny Yang on policy. All of these things are ways of informing yourself of how injustice is currently functioning and what might help remedy that. But if we sort of stop at the panel discussion, that's actually not going to change much. We'll have big heads, but weak hands and hearts. So relationships are part of it. We learn from Christianity and the Bible that all reconciliation is incarnational. All reconciliation is relational. And so for many of us, until we put a human face on injustice, it's going to remain abstract, theoretical, not really that urgent. And so when I was a teacher in the Delta, in one of the poorest counties in the entire country, these issues of justice became real to me, because parents are deciding whether to pay the light bill or buy groceries. A family's car breaks down, they have no money in terms of savings, and now they have to get a ride from relatives who are working and on different schedules, so their kid comes to school late. The kids are functionally homeless, staying at 2 and 3 different places per week because they don't have a permanent residence, and that's affecting their schoolwork. And now, justice is relational. Now, these issues of inequality have a human face on them. And there's a sense in which that has to happen for all of us to really care, to really engage in justice work. It has to become personal, namely through relationships. But a lot of folks stop there, particularly white evangelicals. It's the whole idea of, some of my best friends are black, that we have these personal relationships. And so I'm not being personally bigoted. Check the box, I'm doing my part to fight racism. But as I said in a class earlier today, all the cups of coffee in the world aren't going to close the racial wealth gap. All the lunches in the world aren't going to solve the problem of mass incarceration. So then we have to get involved on a policy level. That's the commitment aspect. What are the operating procedures of our republic that create and perpetuate inequality along racial and class and gender lines, and how do we get involved with that? So it's not a prescription of all the things you can do, but I think it helps us avoid the danger of only focusing on one, awareness or relationships or commitment. We need at least all three to engage in productive, comprehensive, robust, holistic, biblical justice work.
If I can use another acronym, I use the 4 A's, which I actually like your ARC better. But the 4 A's that I use are going from apathy to awareness, awareness to action, and action to advocacy. I think advocacy is the hardest part because it requires systemic change. It requires the use of your voice and ongoing engagement to change systems and structures, which can oftentimes take decades, if not centuries. But we have to start somewhere, and I think from becoming apathetic to aware, follow organizations that you love and that are putting out good information about what's happening. Get engaged in their campaigns, watch documentaries, participate in the trips that your school is taking to different communities so that you can learn firsthand what's actually happening in those communities. And whether it's reading more books or getting other students involved, that kind of action is needed to volunteer at local ministries and different things like that. But as Jemar was saying, I think advocacy is really the tail end of this, which is you can minister and volunteer individually as much as you can, but if you recognize that there are systemic issues that are perpetuating injustice, we have to raise our voices and speak up to change systems and policies and laws. And a lot of that requires mobilizing and getting together with fellow students to contact your elected officials. And I think that's sometimes the most difficult thing to do. But I think in every part of the actions that we talked about, that your engagement is critical.
So
Do you have an acronym?
I have no acronym. I have no acronym.
Make one up real quick. Oh.
Yeah, sorry. I think one of the first things that you have to do is, going back to the Micah 6:8 formulation, seek justice, love mercy, walk humbly. One of the first things you do as part of walking humbly is you have to learn and you have to understand the limits of your knowledge. And so one of the things I make a conscious effort to do is read the best expression of the other side's point of view. I know my own point of view pretty well, and I know who are all the good people to read from my own side, but seek out and find the best expression of the other side's point of view. I also think this is some of my inner civil libertarian is going to come out, and my inner quasi-libertarian conservatism. I think we should approach complex systems with humility. The idea that we can say, okay, here's something that has persistently happened, it is persistently unjust, and I know how to fix it, is a bold statement. And we need to be careful about that while still seeking to fix it. And third, one thing that I think that we can do, and this is my inner civil libertarian is going to be exploding out, is one of the things that we have to understand about injustice in the United States of America is constantly it rests in violation of the Bill of Rights in the Civil War amendments. So we have actually a constitutional guide that has wide consensus in this country that protects an individual from unjust application of government force. And very powerfully protects it if we have courage to uphold it. And that's why I talked about defending the rights of others that I would like to exercise myself. I'm very blessed in this country. I don't have to worry a whole lot about that power of the state coming down upon me. There are other people that do have to worry about that. And I want to defend their right to free speech. I want to defend their right to religious liberty. Here's a big one. I want to defend their right to due process of law. That's a huge issue in this country. I want to defend their right to counsel. I want to defend their equal protection under the law. I want to defend each one of these elements, these fundamental building blocks of our society, that without them, I would submit that the policy superstructures are going to be secondary, because the fundamental division that we will face over these fundamental human rights, the unalienable rights upon which our republic was allegedly founded, and was legitimately founded, but in tension with other acts of injustice. If we don't get that right, we're going to struggle as a country, and we're going to continue to struggle as a country. And so that's why I am such a zealous civil libertarian. I think that is founding, building block Justice 101 in this country.
Thank you all for coming. Let's thank our speakers. Thank you.